theories. And you have seen from the video previously that Lamarck's theory was looking at characteristics of organisms as acquired, and that is they did something to their bodies and the body started to change, and that characteristic was inherited by the offspring from them. So you can imagine somebody doing weight. The muscles are not naturally big, but can do weight, and eventually has very big muscles. Unfortunately, for that kind of characteristic, it cannot be inherited. So that's an acquired characteristic. So Lamarck said such characteristics could be inherited. His idea of inheritance was okay, agreed with Charles Darwin, but we have seen previously that in genetics that is not possible. Anyway, he used the giraffe as an example. So he said that as giraffes reached out to get food from the higher branches, their necks were stretched, and as they continuously stretched their necks, they began to have longer necks. And then therefore this characteristic was passed on to their offspring, and then their offspring with already longer necks stretched them further to get food from higher branches, and eventually had even longer necks. And then that characteristic, as was passed down from generation to generation, eventually ended up with the present giraffes with very long necks. So I just put some notes there about what kind of cells are affected, and that is somatic cells are affected. Somatic cells, as you know, are cells other than gametes. All right. Then we have a look at Charles Darwin's theory. All right, Charles Darwin sailed around the globe on a ship called Beagle. All right, notice I'm using those information that I've seen in the past exam papers, so it is important that you take note also. And the route is shown there. Galapagos Islands is just off the coast of South America. And he published a book, Origin of Species, in 1859. I think in the video I made a mistake. I think I said 1959, even when 1859 is written there. And then he looked at finches, giant tortoises, iguanas as examples of organisms that had similarities and differences from one location to another. We will have a look at the finches later when we look at natural selection. All right, and so as he sailed around, he saw the differences in organisms and similarities. And so his observation he later used to come up with his theory of evolution. So Darwin's theory of evolution based on natural selection is based on these 4 principles: that organisms, when they reproduce, there is a large number of offspring. But then that number does not continue to increase. It eventually starts to remain at a certain level. And that from ecology we've studied, that is because of limiting factors or abiotic factors that affect the population and therefore come to a carrying capacity. So he said it's because of competition, right, as we have seen in studies on populations. And competition, we know, is the struggle for resources by organisms. And that then brings about a control mechanism which controls the number of individuals in a population. In a population also there are variations, which are the differences in characteristics of organisms or individual members of the population. And we've seen in genetics how that is so. And these variations allow for adaptation to be possible. and adaptation, we've seen morphological, behavioral, or physiological changes in organisms that enable them to perform a certain function and therefore improve their chances of survival in the ecosystem. So these four factors allowed for him to come up with the natural selection theory. Anyway, we'll come to that natural selection theory later. Okay. So looking at the giraffe as an example, using Darwin's theory, Darwin said that giraffes had already differences in neck length, and then it was natural selection that allowed for the best adapted organisms or members of the giraffe population to be able to survive. So the longer neck giraffes were able to reach out to higher branches, and so were able to survive better. And they are the ones that continue to live on and pass their genes to the offspring. Whereas the shorter necked ones died of starvation, and so were not able to pass their genes on. So variation, as he has observed, allowed for adaptation to occur, and then it was the genetic material that was inherited. All right, so one thing that you will find in examination and that may be asked is comparing Lamarck's theory to Darwin's theory. So we see here that Lamarck had the same ideas as Darwin's except for one. So his idea of environment having an effect on the phenotype is the same as that of Darwin. Okay, and we've learned that variation is possible because of environmental factors and genetic factors. And that is what makes us who we are. So you remember the idea and the story of the twins I mentioned, all right? So environment has an impact on the phenotype. Also that Lamarck said inheritance of traits from parents is possible. That was also the same idea that Darwin had. However, Lamarck said that acquired characteristics can be inherited, while Darwin said, no, it is genetically influenced characteristics that can be inherited. So that is where Darwin's idea of inheritance differs from that of Lamarck. So it is Darwin's idea that we are using, and so we use the example of variation, which is possible through genetic differences, and then that is what is inherited. And modern science has enabled us to understand that better through the study of genetics. All right, possible examination question, remember that. All right, so how can we disprove Lamarck's theory? All right, that while it is true that environment can have an impact on the, or effect on the phenotype, it cannot change the genotype, and therefore acquired characteristics cannot be inherited. All right, and so one experiment was done where rats' tails were chopped off, and the rats with short tails, after being chopped off, were able to reproduce, and the offspring that were that came about from that cross didn't have short tails; they all had long tails. So we can imagine also for the people who lie out in the sun to get some tan, the skin may be white, yes, it may turn brown after lying out in the sun, but they cannot pass that brown characteristic to their offspring. Somebody with big muscles from doing weights cannot pass that characteristic to the offspring. He will have to be naturally born with big muscles in order to pass that on to the offspring. All right, so then what is evolution? It is a gradual change in the heritable traits within a population across generations. And evolution does not try to explain how life began. That's a different idea altogether. All right. However, it explains the diversification of the changes in organisms over time due to adaptation of organisms as environments change. All right, so here I may just introduce two terms that you will have to read: microevolution and macroevolution. Okay, so should SOE continue, then I may ask you to define those two terms in our next video session. If it does come to an end, then we meet in class and you give me the definitions of these two terms, what they mean. All right. Neo-Darwinism is very straightforward. Just like neo-colonialism in history, Neo-Darwinism is the study of, do you know what Darwinian evolution theory is? The study of evolution based on the use of the recently discovered information on science. So genetics, molecular biology, paleontology, ecology, ethology, are all those areas of science that have contributed to making evolution understood better. So it's referred to as Neo-Darwinism. All right, now we come to look at, just checking my time, I may be running out of time. Fossil evidence of evolution. All right, we got about 5 more minutes. We'll quickly go through 5 to 5 minutes. I will stop and then we will continue for the next 20 minutes. All right, now we come to look at evidence of evolution. So we looked at theories that talk about evolution. So we have now agreed that Darwin's theory of evolution is one that explains gradual change in organisms over time. Now, how can we find out that or prove that evolution did take place? So we begin with fossils as evidence of evolution, and fossils are one of the best known materials that can be used to explain evolution. All right, so rock formation is what we're going to have a look at first, but we're going to go through very quickly. Firstly, the most important thing is sedimentation. Creation of rocks starts from sedimentation. Geography, it might be said that is weathering of the parent rocks brings about sediments, and sedimentation then results. Sedimentation is basically the accumulation of sediments, and what happens is that if remains of organisms are present, then they will be buried, and upon compression and compaction, sedimentary rocks can be formed, and if organisms remains inside those sediments, they can be solidified in there. All right, fossilization, that's basically talking about how fossils are formed. And we've seen that sedimentation has to take place before fossils can be formed, and they can be formed in the sedimentary rocks. And so the places where fossils can be found are in aquatic environments, in the beds of the aquatic environments, or rocks from the water bodies. And they can also be found in these particular things. The amber, which is basically the sap from plants, mainly trees. When they ooze out of the bark, they can collect whatever organism that is around them, and when they solidify, they can capture those organisms in there. Pit bogs are mainly examples with mud. Over time, that mud can dry up and then hold whatever that was dead in there intact. Ice, solid water, can also accommodate a lot of organisms' remains, and the example would be the icebergs. All right, we're almost going to stop now. All right, types of fossils. These are the types of fossils. Fossils we normally refer to as bones, but we will see here that fossils are not only bones, an entire organism may be trapped. Skeleton, that's what we normally refer to as fossils. Molds or casts. All right, impressions, imprints, and then fecal pellets. All right, we will stop here, and then after 5 minutes, we'll resume again. I will now